Ever wondered about women drinking on Purim? Well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss on this 172nd episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of The Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Rabbanit Debbie Zimmerman. So welcome, Rabbanit Zimmerman.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So for those less familiar with Rabbanit Zimmerman, she is a meshivat halakha, a graduate of Matan's Hilkhata program. She is the director of Shayla, an online responsa project by graduates of Matan's Hilkhata program. After completing a BA in social work, Debbie combined teaching in midrashot with her own advanced Torah studies and Matan's program for the study of Bible and Hermeneutics and Talmud and Beit Morasha. She continues to teach Tanakh, Gemara, and Jewish thought to a wide range of students worldwide. She is currently a fellow in the third cohort of the Matan Kitvuni Program to promote the publication of high-level Torah scholarship by women. She is writing a book tentatively titled Redemption Redeemed that seeks to organize and understand the different visions of redemption within traditional Jewish sources, examining common themes and major debates that span generations of prophetic and scholarly descriptions of the stage of redemption. And bringing us to our topic today, she published, like in the last few years, a really fascinating thing on women and alcohol on Purim. Oh, 5 years ago. Wow. 6 years ago. Right?
Yeah.
Here we are, March 2019, Purim, Women and Alcohol, published on the Matan's website. Does a woman have to drink on Purim? And then also related, people are welcome to check out the Sefaria sheet on women and alcohol on Purim. So that brings us, of course, to our discussion today. This is not something we've talked about here about considering women, sort of the gendered aspect regarding Purim drinking. And so for listeners, you probably have checked out one of our many episodes on Purim drinking, a couple episodes on the Talmudic pieces. We did, and then with Rabbi David Fried, we did one on the medieval rabbis, a few on post-medieval rabbis. So there's plenty of stuff we've touched on here, the Jewish Drinking Show, but this is the first time we're discussing women. So, it's interesting, Rabbanit Zimmerman, there's nothing in the Talmud that specifies or mentions anything regarding women and drinking on Purim, right?
No, there's nothing regarding women and drinking on Purim in the Talmud, and there's also nothing in the Rishonim and earlier halakhic authorities and Shulchan Aruch and Rima. It's really, I have not found.
Yes.
So the only thing that I found is really in the past century or so that people are discussing this, which is sociologically and halakhically interesting in and of itself.
So I wonder, maybe it's hard to argue from silence, but are we to, when we look back at this, are we to assume that women were definitely drinking on Purim? Were they maybe drinking on Purim or not drinking on Purim? Or we just really have nothing? We have nothing to tell us one way or the other.
Right. So when this is discussion, we don't really have much. The truth is the Gemara only has one discussion which we will get to about women's drinking in general. And the truth is a lot of women's spaces and women's issues are not really delved into at all in Talmud. Once in a while it's discussed, especially when it has a very clear halakhic entry point, which based on all the discussions really on chayav inish lebasume, on this mitzvah of drinking on Purim, it's unclear how clear the halachic requirement is to begin with just for men, let alone women. And then you can get to, so when you said, should I make an assumption one way or another?
I just want to point out for our listeners. So what Rabbanit Zimmerman just pointed out is a famous statement by Rava, I think 7b in Megillah, on this obligation of getting drunk on Purim. Although it's interesting, he says an inish, although what inish or who might that include or exclude is also an interesting consideration, especially since that line gets directly quoted in Rabbi Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch. So I think that's an important term, I think, for us to consider, right?
Yes, Rabba's statement is chayav inish lebasume ad lo yada dehin Haman lebaruch Mordechai. Right, so a man, inish is specifically the Aramaic word for a man, is obligated to intoxicate himself until he doesn't know between. He can't differentiate between cursed is some and blessed is Mordechai.
Yeah.
The rabbinic opinions on what that means is everything from there is an obligation to get falling down drunk or blackout drunk, depending on how you if you want, you can drink a little bit more than usual. Right. So, and like every single thing in between is there. So when it comes to women, right? So one possible explanation is, oh, women are not included in this because it says chayav inish, a man is obligated, right? So if a man is obligated, oh, women aren't. So that is very firmly rejected, based on the fact that there are a lot of places where the Torah says ish, or where halachot say ish, man, and refer to anyone, men or women, that it's not something that's gendered. Even in the Megillah itself, says that mishloach manot are given mishloach manot ish l're'ehu. When we send portions of food to each other on Purim, we send them from one man to another. That's the term used, one man to his fellow. And rabbinic opinion across the board is that women are included in this mitzvah, even though it's also not discussed in the Gemara whether women are included. But we should have mostly Achronim are the ones who discuss this and say women are
included. It's also interesting because just as you mentioned, ish could be sort of a general thing. I also maybe the word could also be considered as adam, where sometimes adam in rabbinic literature can also just means a person. And so I don't know if that could be sort of some wiggle room for the inclusion of women in Inish.
I would say in general, when we approach Gemara, when we approach rabbinic texts, we can come from an assumption how women are included unless we're told otherwise. Or we can come from an assumption that the default is man and women have to be included. And so I personally prefer the first, perhaps because I'm a woman, but also because when it comes to laws, when it comes to most laws in Judaism, meaning everything that is interpersonal, basically, and most of the laws of festivals and Shabbat and things between a person and God, there's no difference between men and women, or the differences have to do with very physiological things. And there's really only a small amount of things where men and women are differentiated between. They just happen to be the things that really stand out because they are ritual and they are the communal aspect. And so they do tend to stand out. But coming from a place that assumes that anytime the Gemara, Hebrew is a gender language, Aramaic is a gender language, they're always going to speak about men. They're always going to use terms for men unless they're specifically discussing women. It's very different than English. English, you can say a person, but Hebrew doesn't have that word. So it's almost something that I think that there's a bias for people who my first language is English. And I think I came with that bias of thinking anything that's gendered is biased towards men. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Right. So if we get back to this idea, or if you want to, if we get back to this idea, so there's one way to look at it and say that Rava's statement says a man is obligated to get drunk. And there's another way to look at it and say a man means a person. And there's no difference in the laws of Purim between men and women in any of the other laws. Although there are the Gemara specifically has to go out of its way and include Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi's statement that women are included in the mitzvah to hear Megillah. But the Gemara doesn't do that when it comes to the laws of Mishtah, meaning the law of the Suda, the law of the feast, of eating on Purim. It doesn't do that when it comes to Mishloach Manot, sending portions of food, and Matanot Levyonim, sending poor people food or money for food. And those are the mitzvot that are most directly tied to the mitzvah of drinking. There's another way to look at it that would be, well, why would we differentiate between women and drinking when there's no differentiation between women and the other mitzvot? There's some discussion about it when there's a problem with the woman actually fulfilling the mitzvah. Like if a woman doesn't have money because all her money is her husband's, can she really give gifts to the poor? So there's some discussion, but really the overwhelming rabbinic majority says women have the same obligation as men in all these other Purim mitzvot. So then the latest mitzvah and the least discussed mitzvah in the Gemara of drinking, right? The question would be, is a woman included in that or not?
Yeah.
And the answer is we shouldn't assume either way, right? There's kind of no way to assume, because one way to look at it is just a man. Another way is
so
women didn't drink back then, so it would be.
So I hadn't
if
considered
women didn't drink
before.
back then socially, yeah.
All right, so something I hadn't considered before. Now I'm thinking about the matanot levionim, the gifts, or I'm sorry, that's gifts to the poor. But even just giving food to one's neighbors or fellow people. So maybe that, since that's a food and drink related thing, maybe this could all, and there's sort of an inclusion of women with that. Maybe also with the Suda, with the drinking and the eating, maybe that would also be inclusive of women. Is that something that comes up?
Right. Yes, meaning that is one of the opinions, is basically the mitzvot of Purim. When you look at the classical way to divide them, is the Megillah itself mentions that the Jewish people celebrated that first year with simcha and mishteh, right? With rejoicing and with a mishteh, which is a feast, but it's a feast that includes drinking, right?
It's a drinking
from the
party.
root shata, which means to drink.
It's a drinking
It's
party.
a drinking party, or at least it was, even though the Megillah knows how to say mishteh yain, which that is very specifically a drinking party. It's a drinking wine, literally.
It's a wine
right?
drinking party,
Whereas
as opposed
you could
to
say that mishteh, right? It's a wine drinking party.
Well, as opposed to beer or any other beverages.
Maybe.
So it's something that specifies that this is, and maybe this is more special because it's just wine as opposed to a regular mishteh that you could see beer or other beverages being mead, etc., being included.
Right.
Hey there, it's Adar. This is a Purim episode. If you want to find out more Purim episodes or just simply other resources about Purim, feel free to check out jewishdrinking.com/Purim. Again, jewishdrinking.com/Purim for resources, articles, essays, clips, and so much more, all about Purim. Thank you. Now back into the episode.
Even though the Gemara doesn't discuss whether or not women are part of these mitzvot, they only discuss the mitzvah of the Megillah, which is not explicitly talked about in the Megillah itself. The Megillah just says that the Jewish people were told to do these mitzvot. And that directive was sent out from Esther and Mordechai. So it seems like it should apply to all the Jewish people and not just the men, right? Even without Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And it does seem like the drinking, like you said, is really part of that meal to begin with. Perhaps Rava is merely quantifying how much drinking there should be. Everyone was already drinking, but Rava was saying how much you should drink. And so in that case, you would think, oh, maybe the assumption is women drink. The other side is to say, well, if women didn't drink in general, then why would women drink now? And then the kind of negation of that, kind of opposite, the response to that would be, oh, well, women, also Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, women drink the 4 cups on Pesach. And maybe that was necessary for him to say so people wouldn't think women shouldn't be drinking 4 cups of wine, even though there's a breita that says that women are included in the mitzvah. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi comes along and says, yeah, women drink 4 cups of wine. Next thing to start off from is if we can't tell from the actual obligation or directive to drink on Purim, maybe we could tell from other rabbinic attitudes towards women drinking.
So I'm going to pick up on that thread that you just dropped out there about other rabbinic attitudes towards women's drinking. So I think both of us have in mind a very famous breita, early rabbinic text that talks about what happens at different levels of women's becoming intoxicated.
The breita, which is bought in Ketubot on Samach Hayamid Aleph, so 65a, it says 1 cup of wine is good for women. 2 cups is a disgrace for her. 3 cups, she demands with her mouth, meaning she speaks a demand, and the demand that this is referring to is a demand for conjugal relations. And the 4th cup, this is a very crass, but the Gemara says it, so I'm going to say it also. She is so non-discerning in her desire to be physically intimate with someone that she will even demand a donkey in the marketplace.
Which,
right? So
and this really just escalates super quickly. It's like super quickly escalating.
Yeah.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to jump in and give you a sneak preview of next week's episode, also about Purim.
The adolescent body tends to be smaller than ours and less tolerant of alcohol, and that is particularly true among girls. Girls just metabolize alcohol more slowly than boys.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode on Purim. I hope you come back into this episode on women drinking on Purim.
You mentioned earlier, no medieval Rishonim, no medieval authorities write anything specifically about women's drinking at Purim. And it sounds like even in, I would imagine, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, also centuries, no one's writing about this. As far as you've discovered. Yeah, that you found, right?
As far as I've seen.
Okay. But really it comes up, is it 19th or the 20th century is the first you found any rabbinic writings?
I would say maybe, so the first one's in Shevet Halevi, or Rosner.
So 20th century.
I think it's Rav Rosner, and then so it's 20th century, Rav Moshe Sternbach, also 20th century. So yeah, really much later.
Yeah.
And
so,
I
wonder
very
why.
much so wonder why.
Yeah, I wonder why. If you had to come up with something, what's your speculation as to why only in the 20th century is this now coming to rabbinic writings?
So I think there's a number of possible reasons, and it could possibly be confluence of some of them.
Yeah.
I think one is society, even more Haredi, more strict society, is becoming increasingly perhaps men and women together, not coeducational, but it's increasingly mixed, which is one possibility. I always thought it was interesting that Rava and Rabbi Zera were both married men, are having Purim students. Where are their wives?
They may be around.
Where are their wives?
Rabba and Rabbi Zera's wives might have been around. Oh.
Yeah, they might have been around.
I
feel like a wife would have stopped her husband from killing his friend, but I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know either. But I think it really feels like it's just the two of them. Just like it feels like when the rabbis are sitting in Bnei Brak, were their children there? Were their wives there? What's going on? So, and I think that part of what's happening is, on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, the whole, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and rupture and reconstruction, and people just used to do what their parents did. And so for something like this, really, we didn't need it to be codified. It's just whatever your house did, and if you were used to drinking wine or not, and what you would do. So I think that that's a possibility also.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's also possible that it's the complete opposite, and it was so everyone just assumed women didn't drink. And there weren't necessarily women's only spaces. And women were perhaps, for those men who like to go very far into this, women might have been the ones who had to be responsible for them and the babysitters. So there's a number of...
Do you think, I'm going to pull on that thread. Do you think maybe part of it could have been perceived through a lens of one of the sort of common rabbinic things that we say is that women are exempt from prescriptive time-bound mitzvot, and maybe this is just one of them that they are just exempt from? Or is that something that comes up in the writings that we should probably dive into?
It doesn't come up in the writings, which
really?
Makes sense that it shouldn't come up in the writings, because they're not exempt from any other aspect of the mitzvot of Purim. Okay. And really, there's one of the approaches to women's exemption from time-bound mitzvot, positive time-bound mitzvot, are that this only applies to biblical mitzvot. It doesn't apply to rabbinic mitzvot at all. That's one explanation. And again, there's also Rambam's explanation, which really comes from the Gemara itself, where the Gemara says, wait, are they really exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot? And then says, no, it's just a general rule. And the Gemara says, we don't learn from general rules. You can't go and put more things into this list.
Yeah.
It's just a rule of thumb. It's I before E except after C. It doesn't work all the time.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right. Thank you so much, L'chaim. And now back into the episode.
So you mentioned who these 20th century rabbis are. So what did each of them write, and what do they have to say about this question?
Right. So what I thought was actually most interesting, which I'll start out with, is the two really bigger halakhic authorities that I found who wrote about it, which was Rav Rosner and Shevet Halevi, and Rav Moshe Sternbuch in Moadim Bizmanim. So both of them also do not seem so happy with men drinking to the point of drunkenness, or possibly men drinking at all. Which I found fascinating.
Yeah.
So we'll put it. So I'll explain as we go in. But so those are the two who discuss women specifically. And Shevet Halevi says women don't have an obligation to get drunk. And he bases this on the Gemara in Ketubot that we saw, and on that Braita that when women get drunk,
on the 4 cups,
food.
on the 1, 2, 3, 4 cups.
Yes. But then he continues on to basically also say there are places in the Gemara where the Gemara discusses men also not behaving so well when they get very drunk. And really the story that the whole discussion in the Gemara, whether the story of Rabban Rabbi Zera's drinking together
memorable
on
Purim,
memorable Purim, whether that's something that tells you, oh yes, this is how you fulfill this mitzvah by going to excess, or no, this is not how you, or we should, pull back, don't get to the point where you're going to murder someone and black out drunk, or something in the middle, or completely rejects it, right? So he also says, really, we have to question what does adalo yada mean? Meaning, he doesn't question whether men should drink. He questions what is really the point of the discussion, which is how much, how far, which is what most rabbis get stuck on. But he says women don't have to drink at all. They don't have an obligation. He doesn't say they're not allowed to drink at all.
So they're exempt, but they can still fulfill it.
No, it doesn't seem. No, he doesn't want women to get drunk because, you've discussed in previous. Well, as you've discussed, meaning he says the Gemara in Ketubot basically tells us women shouldn't be getting drunk. So, and as you've discussed previously, there's some question whether whether men are always allowed to get drunk, or people are always allowed to get drunk, or there's like an exception for a particular extent of drunkenness on Purim, and otherwise the rabbis were more into now moderation doesn't mean you can't get drunk, but maybe not blackout drunk, or
it's interesting because as one who goes through drunkenness in rabbinic literature, there's not a lot of really negative attitudes displayed towards drunkenness. I think generally when it comes up, drunkenness is just sort of there in the background. There's no moral valence, positive or negative, really ascribed to it. And so it's fascinating when post-Talmudic rabbis try to cherry pick these various stories that they think put drunkenness in a negative light. They're ignoring so much, or really most of the text regarding drunkenness in rabbinic literature. Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right. Thank you so much. Now back into the show.
If you're a woman who wants to get drunk, you have to make sure you're in a safe space, unfortunately. And unfortunately, there's a lot of places that aren't safe spaces for women. So but that's more like the bottom line.
Well, actually, this is an important, I think this is a very important thing this is an important thread I want to pull on, which is because we did mention that the very first two stories of drunkenness in the Tanakh are regarding an ease of sexual access. And so I think once you put drunkenness into play into Purim, especially with women, that there's a greater degree of vulnerability generally, and sexual vulnerability in particular. And I think that's something we can't ignore, right?
Right. The truth is, when you look at if you look at other rabbinic times where they're a little bit worried about people getting carried away, it generally talks about times where they're drinking and eating. So Simchat Beit Shoeva, right? The Sukkot festivities, they were very worried about. And in general, they say during holidays, you have to watch out in the parks, in the fields, and by the rivers, because you might find men and women because people are drinking more. And so I sometimes wonder, like I said before, maybe women were the babysitters. Like, if women can't police the men's bad behavior, if that's what's expected from them, and women instead become ones who also desire this bad behavior, who's going to police? But then again, if you're a woman in a midrashah full of 18-year-olds or 18 to 20-year-olds in an all women space, where you're singing and saying words of Torah and celebrating together, and it's pretty clear that you're not going to go out and look for a man or a donkey, or anything else. So then maybe it's not as much of a problem. Unfortunately, I can't ask Rav Wosner about this. We want to go back to, but that was right. So his was, women behave lewdly and therefore they can't get drunk. And he seems to also not want men to get to a point where they'll behave lewdly. And we have Rav Moshe Sternbach, who also, he says, women are not obligated to get drunk, even though they're obligated in all the other mitzvot of Purim. So then he has to figure out, why is this? So he says the first thing is that ein derech nashim b'shichrut, that the way of women is not to get drunk. Women aren't people who get drunk, right? And because they don't normally get drunk, therefore there's more of a risk of them that it will lead to bad behavior and lewd behavior. So and big sins, very big sins. That's what he says. So he says that's the first part, but he says the second part is that today's feasts don't normally include alcohol, which is why women don't normally get drunk. Meaning, and it's not 100% true, right? Some people do, but not in the same excess of, when you watch a Hollywood movie and see the Vikings, or certainly the Greeks and the Romans and right? It's not on a normal way. When you go to a palace, you don't want to get that drunk, right? When you're really, so he says, so because of that, like, it's also really not necessarily part of, right? He says we also have to explore what is the mitzvah exactly. But he says, like, it's just not the way of feasts nowadays. And he adds that if it wasn't for all the other halachic authorities that say there is a mitzvah to get very drunk, he doesn't see why. He says he has a good reason why men should not be scrupulous with this mitzvah.
Oh, interesting. I also wonder in the 20th century, even throughout the world, what's like in the 19th century, we know that generally people, not necessarily specifically Jews, but generally people in the world, people were drinking so much in the 19th century, and at least in the Western world, it was just like vast quantities that would even make us blanch, I think. But in the 20th century, things start calming down, especially in the late 19-teens and 1920s. People know about prohibition and temperance in America, but it was happening in Canada. It was happening in Europe. People were trying to, put a kibosh on drinking as much. But I also wonder how this interplays with like post-World War II, right? So I imagine, at least in the Western world, in the latter half of the 20th century, maybe drinking has less of a negative valence, but I don't know how much people were getting drunk generally in the Western world at the time.
So I always think, but the Western world and America, in this case, I think are two very different things, because America was started, like the colonialist America was started with, right, the people who came from Europe, the original people who came were Puritans, and they were very anti-drinking, and they were very anti-excess. And so that is often why America has much more puritanical standards when it comes to things like drinking, overindulging, even when it comes to, sex. America is a lot stricter than Europe. And I think a lot of the roots are this puritanical background. I will also say, look, I think that there's a huge difference between drinking, which I think, like you said, it's part of life, it's completely normal. And then, yes, sometimes people would overindulge. When they overindulge, though, most of the stories of people getting drunk, they don't do positive acts afterwards.
So now that you've shared both Rabbi Wozner and Rabbi Sternbach, any others that you came across?
Rabbi Eliezer Melamed talks about the idea. He says, now again, he's not considered as big a posek, but his books are very popular for very good reason. And he's definitely someone worth reading. So he says women do have a mitzvah to drink wine because wine is mitzameh. Wine makes you happy, it gladdens you. He says, but women have to be more careful than men not to get drunk because it is more disgraceful for women. So again, this kind of double standard, which I don't love. Now, I do think, so there's like a number of thoughts that I have when I see all these sources.
Yeah.
Because when it comes, so let's say Rabbi Eliezer Melamed says women should drink wine because they should be sameh. Interestingly, when it comes, let's say, the Gemara, when it talks about simcha on Yom Tov on festivals, when it talks about rejoicing on festivals, it says, oh, men, so men should, how do men rejoice? With meat and wine. And women should rejoice in what they enjoy, which is nice clothes according to them, and children get nuts, basically candy and things like that, right? So everyone should rejoice in what makes them happy. Which I think is number one, very fair. And I think it's a good rule for Purim also, meaning that idea of if wine or alcohol of any sort helps you rejoice, then to at least have some seems like a good part of Purim. That's number one, right? Obviously, if it doesn't, or certainly if it's dangerous for you for any reason, then obviously you shouldn't be happy. So I think that that's one aspect. I think also that source in Pesachim makes it interesting, that idea of are women drinking wine or not. And I think it really does seem to say that it's according to minhag hamakom, the local custom. And actually, when it comes to the halakha in Ketubot of do women get wine or get support for wine, Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, they both say that if it's the custom in the place for women to drink wine, then women get wine. And if it's not the local custom, then they don't. Which seems to be what comes out of the Gemara also. If it was either her custom with her husband or the local custom. There doesn't seem to be an issue with women drinking. But if a woman doesn't normally drink, then let's face it, we know if people don't normally drink, then drinking even one cup of wine can be very unpleasant. So maybe she's not obligated because of that. A lot of rabbinic authorities talk about drinking, not a lot as in the majority, but several rabbinic authorities talk about drinking a little bit more than you're used to. Right? Now, if someone's used to getting drunk, and again, in a safe way, in a way that doesn't, whatever, then they can drink a little more than usual. If someone's used to getting tipsy, they can drink a little more. If someone's used to having a glass, they can have another glass. Right? So that also seems to be a normal rule for a woman. A woman who drinks more can drink more. A woman who drinks less drinks less. So I think, those are I think the bigger, I think those opinions that say that there is a mitzvah to drink so much, you are not in control of your faculties to a certain extent, depending on what that extent is. I find it tough to think that the rabbis would want that for women, but I also find it tough, like Rav Sternbach and like Rav Wozner, I found it tough to think that the rabbis would really want that for men also. I do think anything that harms the body to a certain extent is not something that the rabbis necessarily want. I think it's very possible. The rabbis do seem to be aware that alcohol affects women differently than it does men, as a general rule. And it's not just because women are normally smaller, but it has to do with fat content in the body and how the alcohol is processed in the body. And again, whether you're used to drinking and you develop the tolerance. So I think all of this should be included. I think all of this was included to kind of make this question of, okay, so how drunk do women get, right? That's, we go back to the question.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the answer would be where they are, which I think is also an answer for men. This past year, a man asked me about getting drunk. He says he normally does Rambam. He gets so drunk, he gets drunk until he passes out.
Yeah, falls asleep.
And it bothers his wife and children. Yeah. And it makes his wife very upset. It bothers his children. They don't get to enjoy themselves. And so I gave him all the different opinions. I told him, look, there are other ways to do this mitzvah. Depends what you want to do. And we had a long back and forth. And he said in the end, he didn't drink. And it was and his wife had a great time and his children had a great time. And I talked to him about the idea that really Purim is a time for families to be together. He's not in yeshiva anymore with a bunch of guys where he can do whatever he wants. He's responsible for children. He's responsible for his wife's happiness, according to also a lot of Talmudic and rabbinic sources. And so he needs to take these other people into account.
Yeah.
So the same way, right? So you have to take the people around you into account. You have to take into account your personal safety. You have to take into account your safety. And unfortunately for women, for men also, it means there are certain places you don't want to lose your way. But for women, unfortunately, it's more places maybe.
How did you decide to embark upon exploring this topic?
After I finished the halakha program in Matan, which is a program that's parallel to Smicha program. So I wanted to write more about halakha. I was writing a bit for the Matan site that I'm now the director of, Shayla. And I was also approached to write for Derech, which is this wonderful site that Rabbanit Lori Novik began with the support of Migdal Oz and Yeshivat Har Tzion and a bunch of other organizations. And Derech is a website I highly recommend. It is a website completely dedicated to halakha for women. So the question that we discussed in the beginning and at the top of this of chayav inish lebesume, right? A man is obligated to get drunk. Okay, well, what about a woman? So that every mitzvah, the plan is to go through every and any mitzvah, whether or not there's every mitzvah, I should say. But she started with the mitzvah that have the biggest differences and with the basics of these approaches. But there are, even when we think that mitzvot don't have a difference, like with the mitzvot of Purim, all of a sudden you come and you see that there is. So I was approached to writing about Purim. I can't remember. It's possible that she was the one who said I particularly would like to see people, women and drinking. Very possible that was her. If not, then it also comes from our students. Meaning we have students. I taught with Lori in Nishmat back then. Nishmat has a zero alcohol on Purim policy. I studied in midrashot Lindenbaum. Midrashot Lindenbaum when I was there, at least. So the chutznikiyot, the people from outside of Israel, were not allowed to drink, and the Israelis were full. Some of that was the drunkest I've ever seen people. I was worried about some of them. So you see, even in these women's only environments, you kind of get to these things. And I went through different periods with my friends and different ways of celebrating Purim in terms of drinking. I remember in university, we started having women's only sudot so we could safely get drunk. Or whoever wanted to drink could. And that was really the intent of it, was to make sure that we had a safe space. We were in the girls' dormitory. So gone through different places in my life, my own observance. So it was interesting in me to look at it. That's where it really came up. And then once I did this and I Derech only got to touch on a little piece of it, it was really more about the halakha side. I couldn't discuss as much these sociological things that I think are very important, because halakha obviously should never ignore sociological aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So I also wanted to make sure to have a space to talk about that. So my two vote are obviously a little bit more personal as opposed to an article that's just by me, but isn't my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Summary of other people's. So that's where the Tshuva and Matan came from. And I also got a specific question about it, I should say. But in general, I'm always fascinated by these questions of how great should we assume that women are included, or should we assume women are not included? When do we see a difference? When don't we?
Now that you published it 6 years ago, what types of feedback have you received in the half dozen years since you published it?
It's by far the one I get the most feedback about.
Oh, wow. All right.
Still, yeah.
So what kind of feedback do you
actually
receive?
Every year, only positive.
Oh,
often
great.
from teachers at midrashot. Often teachers at midrashot that reach out to me and say, thank you so much. Either because I couldn't find anything about women, or because I wanted something written by a woman for women.
Yeah.
Or I never thought about it this way, and I was Googling and I came upon it. So all these different things. Every year I get a few more emails like this. So that's nice.
Yeah.
I think it's also, and I've gotten a lot of people said, thank you, because this is what I've been wanting to say, but I didn't have a way to say it. Because I think it's what a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues are women who we have a certain, what you might call Western feminist ideals, of not being particularly comfortable for certain halakhic differentiations between men and women, and having to reconcile that with other beliefs. And sometimes it reconciles very easily and sometimes it does not. And so I think something like this that takes halakha and tries to understand it, but I hope it was in an unapologetic way, meaning I really do think that it's possible that the rabbinic literature had in mind that women do react to alcohol differently because that's what they saw. And it does work with medical stuff that we see. But also it's possible they don't know 100% what's going on in the women's space. What are the men and women having students together? Are they not?
It is interesting what you just mentioned about the sort of the Western feminist ideals and not wanting to have these differentiations. And then here this comes in. How do you feel about this? I guess because the differentiation, because of both the sort of the physiological and the sociological, is it just you're more accepting of those factors than trying to sort of flatten any differentiation that may arise with this particular practice?
There are a lot of different streams of feminism. When the Me Too movement came out, this will connect. When the Me Too movement came out,
it's also drinking.
A lot of Hollywood actresses. Well, when the Me Too movement came out, so Hollywood actresses were coming out and telling about cases where they were taken advantage of. And Mayim Bialik wrote an article where she said this has never happened to her, and she thinks it's possible because she doesn't play certain roles and she dresses in a certain way, and she won't be alone in a hotel room with a man, and different things like that.
Yeah.
And then a lot of women came out against her, saying that she was shaming behavior, she was blaming victims. And so here's the thing. I do think that there's a very fine line between saying these are the preventative measures I take and blaming the victim, right? The same way that, right, when you're a tourist, where are you keeping your wallet? If it's a city with pickpockets, and you have to be careful. So no one, when you get pickpocketed, right, and people are like, oh, you shouldn't have left your wallet there, but they don't blame you for it. But for some reason, when a woman is attacked, she gets blamed for putting herself in that situation. So that's not okay. I don't think Mayim was blaming women. I read what she wrote. I don't think she was blaming them. I think she was saying there are preventative measures that you can take to make you a less likely target. It's not going to prevent everything. But I think we see this all the time. We see this with our children, and we see this in a lot of places. So I think here too, when it comes to women, we have to understand the differences. We can't, if we forget about them, it's very dangerous. And it puts everyone in a dangerous situation. It's women in a dangerous situation. It's men in a dangerous situation. So I don't think we can forget about these differences. We should acknowledge them. But when we acknowledge them, we can also acknowledge that then there might be exceptions, just like the rabbis talked about exceptions of women who are used to drinking, or if the drinks are, spaced farther apart and they're a necessary part of the ritual on Pesach, so that's also fine.
Mm-hmm.
Also, and again, I think people weren't worried about getting drunk on Pesach because of the atmosphere of what was going on.
Rabbanit Zimmerman, this has been fascinating, insightful. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
So the first thing I would say is take a look at Shayla, see what we
Mm-hmm.
have there. If you have any questions, myself and the other meshivot halakha
Mm-hmm.
are happy to answer them. There are links on the site. You can also email shayla@matan.org.il.
Mm-hmm.
And we're actually in the middle of putting out, myself and my colleague, we are in the middle of putting out a series on mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, interpersonal mitzvot, which we think do not get the proper halachic attention that, and especially in this day and age when we need to be reaching out to each other and working on our relationships with other people.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that we should be focused on. So you can check that out. Also, you can subscribe to the emails if you want.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. And in 3 years, hopefully 4 years, please God, I will have a book out on redemption. You can take a look at that.
Okay,
And look out for the other books from the Kitvuni Fellows.
Okay, wonderful. All right, with that, thank you so much, Rabbanit Zimmerman. With that, we're going to say l'chaim. L'chaim.
Bye.